So, welcome everybody. So, this is the last pedagogical lecture of this school come workshop, and our short talk has already started, but we have the last lecture on pedagogical lecture from Vivian, and he will cover a little bit on PBH, which was left over from yesterday, and then Axions, his signature in cosmology. And Vivian is a faculty in University of Montpellier, and welcome. Yeah. Good.
Thank you, Subinoy. So hi, everyone again. So yes, so today I could not discuss something that I think is still interesting to hear about primordial black holes. And so I'm going to discuss that in the next 5 to 10 minutes. And then I'll talk about the gravitational signatures of ultralight axions, so the complement of what David has discussed and the impact on large-scale structure in particular. So coming back to primordial black holes first, and the thing that I wanted to discuss is the so-called supermassive black holes problem. And this is the fact that we know that there are supermassive black holes with masses greater than 10 to the 5. This is a generic conventional definition that sits at the center of almost every galaxies. And we know that their accretion disk emission is saturating the background of X-ray emission that we can see. And supermassive black holes with extremely large mass, even greater than 10 to the 9, have been observed at fairly high redshift, greater than 6, and can look into these references if you're interested into those observations. And the question is, do we have time how is it possible for standard matter, for standard black holes to form those objects? And to cut it short, the answer is no. The answer is, or it's unclear, rather should be the answer. First, from purely accretion, we can estimate that the maximum accretion that can be obtained is when you saturate, or in the standard picture, at least until people started to be more clever, when you saturate what's called the Eddington accretion rate, that is the accretion rate that you can reach when the luminosity counterbalances the accretion, the gravitational energy. And a rough estimate give you that the time scale for accretion associated to this Eddington accretion is of order hundreds of million years. And if you play with the numbers, you'll find that it's barely enough for a stellar mass black hole that's formed typically when the first stars form at redshift 15, maybe 20, with a mass, if you're a bit optimistic, of order 100 solar mass to grow to such very high mass. So there are, but this is not completely impossible, especially if you had, but this is a problem of the models. And there are several possibilities that have been studied. Of course, there is the possibility that this Eddington accretion is not the true maximal accretion that you can reach. Talk about super Eddington accretions. It's possible that black holes actually merge, and there are lots of measures that leads from this lower mass to this very high mass. It's also possible that huge gas clouds didn't go through the phase of creating stars, but directly collapsed to a very high mass black hole, supermassive black holes. But all of that are hypotheses. I don't think there is yet a clear answer as to what is the true explanation for such massive black hole. And one of the possibilities that has been discussed, and if you want a review about this, I recommend this paper, is that supermassive black holes could have been seeded by primordial black holes. And just so you have orders of magnitude in mind, if you want to explain the densities of supermassive black holes in the universe, all you need is a fraction of primordial black holes in the form of supermassive black holes of order 10 to the minus 8. And so the problem of fractional primordial black holes now brings us to the question of what makes the rest of the dark matter, and this is what I wanted to discuss, is that if dark matter is made of particles, they might lead to the creation of a dark halo around the primordial black holes that can have an impact on the accretion rate and on the constraints that you can derive for on the fraction of primordial black holes. So this is something that has been noted already in the past, and I've been recently involved in trying to update these constraints. And so what has been shown by numerical simulations is typically that, or it's somewhat a proxy, but it's been shown to work fairly well. I don't know if you remember from yesterday, but the key quantity to estimate in order to compute the accretion rate is the so-called Bondi radius, which is the quantity that describe basically the radius at which matter is being accreted. And what we can do is update the calculation of the boundary radius by incorporating. So this is the gravitational potential created by the black hole, and this is simply the gravitational potential created by the halo. And you ask when this is equal to the speed or the kinetic energy, and you have to find what is the typical kinetic energy of your in the problem, in the context that you're studying. So when the gravitational energy is equal to the kinetic energy, and you call the radius at which that happens, you call that the boundary radius typically. And you can solve that iteratively, and there are actually but you need to know what is the gravitational potential created by the black holes, by the dark matter created by the what is the density profile of the dark matter created by the presence of the black hole. And there has been analytical studies of that problem. There are actually solutions already studied back in 1985, and the big question is, does dark matter acquire some angular momentum or not? Currently, the consensus, this is what I'm showing you here, the consensus is that the dark matter profile close to halos, close to primordial black hole, it's quite spiky, it's forming this r to the -9 to the 2.25 or 9/4 type of profile, and far away from the black hole, it's simply the r to the -3. This is what is shown here. And by simply resolving this equation and equating both sides, so the question is, in the cosmological context, what should we take as the typical velocities? So we discussed yesterday that the sound speed in the medium is one of the velocities that was first introduced. Another possibility is the relative velocity that you can estimate from linear perturbation theory between black holes and dark matter, or you can take a weighted average of both. This shows you the typical velocities, and this shows you here when the two are equal, allows you to determine what is the boundary radius. And you see that changing this velocity doesn't impact so much the value of the boundary radius here, at least for the qualitative purpose we want. So and intuitively, what you imagine, that you can understand, is that without the black hole, without the dark matter, the boundary radius is much smaller than with the dark matter. So it means that you can accrete more matter, and the constraints are going to increase. And this is something that we have done here, this paper recently, and using Planck data. The red constraints are the constraints assuming that there is no particle of dark matter around the black hole, and the lighter red constraints are obtained once you include the dark matter halo, and you see that the constraints can be much stronger. On the right-hand side, I show you what happens for the spherical accretion scenario, which I recall is the conservative accretion scenario, where on the left-hand side, you have the disk accretion scenario, which I believe is a little bit more realistic, but a bit more aggressive as well. And this can really come and increase the constraints. However, and this is the constraint that you would get if you were to assume that all the black holes from the beginning had accreted at their maximal accretion rate. That was the Eddington accretion rate. And so you see that you can, with this increased accretion rate, especially for high mass black hole, you tend to reach this, let's say, extreme limit that you can derive from the cosmic microwave background. However, these constraints, even though they are very strong, they can cut, to the 10 to the -8 level the fraction of primordial black holes. They can limit to the 10 to the -8 level the fraction of primordial black holes at high mass. They actually still are not sensitive enough to test the hypothesis that the supermassive black holes are primordial. So this is still a possibility from the point of view, at least, of the cosmic microwave background anisotropies. From the point of view of the spectral distortion, we argued that you need some non-Gaussianities, but from the point of view of the anisotropies, this is completely fine. Of course, here I was assuming that the dark matter does not annihilate, and we are just looking at the impact of the accretion. But if the dark matter annihilates, the constraints again changes, because now you are increasing the densities of dark matter, and eventually this can lead to a very, very strong annihilation signal, that even actually can leads to this. So there is a maximum density that you will reach when the accretion rate is the annihilation rate is so strong that it can deplete the population of dark matter particle, and this you can estimate by just comparing the Hubble rate to the typical annihilation rate. And by using the profile that I showed before, you find the typical value of the radius at which this is achieved. And you see that basically, if dark matter annihilates, you have this cuspy profile with a flattening given by the fact that at some point you deplete the dark matter particles. And if you look for those annihilation products, gamma rays, for instance, here in the galactic signal or in the extragalactic signal, you can actually have extremely, extremely strong constraints on the existence of primordial black holes. And you see that the masses here are extremely large. It's a very broad range of mass. And I think this one is actually a very recent paper. So this is to show you that, again, it is a very, very active field. Of course, now you are assuming something about the dark matter properties. You're assuming also something about the scaling of the annihilation cross-section with the velocities and so on. So this is not at all a model-independent constraint, but this is something to keep in mind. And the thing that is interesting, that I'm not going to talk about, but I'm just mentioning, is that also the opposite argument is true. That is, if we were to detect primordial black holes, for instance, if we were to prove that supermassive black holes are seeds from primordial black holes, are seeded by primordial black holes, or we could detect primordial black holes by LIGO and so on. Well, what this is going to have implication for the WIMP scenarios, because the WIMP scenario, because the presence of primordial black holes lead to this very large cusp that could completely change the annihilation signal of WIMPs. And if we don't see this annihilation signal, this would strongly constrain the WIMP. And this has pushed people to say dark matter. I didn't mean to say dark matter or WIMP, sorry. I meant to say PBH or WIMP. It's all or nothing is the type of scenarios that people have in mind. It's complicated to have coexistence of both. Of course, if you change what you call a WIMP, that's if you have a little bit more of a broader definition of what you call a WIMP, that might not be the case, but in the vanilla models, this would be the case. So this is all I wanted to say about primordial black holes. If there are any questions, please go ahead, and then I'm going to move on to the action-like particle constraints.
I don't see any questions, so you can move on. Yeah.
Very good. Yeah. So let me see if I can do this. Okay, sorry. So it's a little bit of an abrupt change of topic, but I would like to move on and discuss the part that David Marsh didn't really cover in these lectures, that are the cosmological signatures of action-like particles, so the impact on, and I'm going to limit myself to the gravitational signatures because otherwise it's going to take way too long and probably also talks by other people than me. But typically I'm going to try to explain to you how we can look for action-like particles using the cosmic microwave background, using the large-scale structure, and then I'm going to connect to the matter power spectrum here. And then I'm going to change a little bit the topic and not going to talk anymore about action-like particle as a dark matter candidate, but you know that action-like particles are also used in the context of dark energy, of inflation, and I would like to show you that these properties can actually also be used to explain something that has been recently pointed out, that is the existence of the Hubble tension, a tension between the measurement of the expansion rate today and the expansion rate as compared between the prediction of the lambda CDM for the expansion rate today and their direct measurement. So if I have time, I'll try to reach that last point. If I don't, I'll talk just about the dark matter aspects. So this is something, to put it on the scales, this is something you have seen already from David Marsh lectures. And what I'm talking about are light axions on these sides here. And I would like to talk about the linear cosmology and why also those models were interesting or are believed to be interesting from the point of view of the so-called cold dark matter crisis, the small-scale structure crisis. So again, to put it in numbers, what we are talking about are masses of order 10 to the minus 33 to 10 to the minus 18 EV. I forgot to write EV, sorry. I'm going to assume that the potential has the standard form that has been discussed earlier, where to recall here, F is the spontaneous symmetry breaking scale at which your Galton boson appear. Lambda generates the mass for your axion, and you can define the action mass simply by this relation. And in the cosmological context, the Klein-Gordon equation allows you to compute the energy density and the pressure of the field, or the stress energy tensor, sorry, allow you to, with the Friedmann-Lemaitre equation allows you to compute the energy density and pressure of the field, and the Klein-Gordon equation will then allow you to know how the field evolves to compute this as a function of time, or scale factor. And in the limit where the field value is small compared to the decay constant, you end up with the standard m square phi square type of potential. And as David has explained, you can solve exactly this equation when h, the Hubble rate, is dominated by a single component. I'm going to do directly to numerical simulations or the resolution, so I'm not going to assume this. And you've seen these plots already. Oh, sorry. And the big question is, of course, how do you degenerate a cosmological population of axions? This is also something that has been covered already, so I just want to recall that typically there are 4 ways. You can imagine first a thermal population, but this is rather for high mass axion. This is not what I'm talking about. You can imagine, and this is relying on the coupling of the axions to the standard model, which is also not what I'm going to cover today. You can imagine that the axion is being produced from the decay of some other particle. This is also not what I'm going to talk about today. You can then imagine, depending on when the symmetry breaking happened, whether it's before or after inflation, you can have various scenarios again for the production of the axions. If the breaking of the symmetry happens after inflation, this is again what David has discussed yesterday. You have topological defects that can form, and the decay of the topological defects, typically in the form of strings, can lead to the production of axions. This is not what I'm going to talk about. What I'm going to talk about, what people are usually the most interested in, are when you think about dark matter, ultralight axions, and connection to the small scale structure problem, are dark matter axions produced by the misalignment mechanism. That is, the symmetry breaking scale typically has not been is broken before inflation, yes. And you have a population of axions that are produced from the coherent initial displacement of the axion field, which takes, thanks to inflation, a coherent value all over the Hubble rate, the scales that matter for our studies. And so basically, then we can solve the Klein-Gordon equation that I showed before, starting from an initial field value that is a random number that we can between -pi and pi. And the Klein-Gordon equation has a very specific evolution depending on the mass. So if you remember, the mass is simply related to the potential or the derivative of the potential. And what you find is that at early time, when the Hubble rate is very large compared to the mass, the field is frozen. And this is in the equation of states of your field, or that dictates how the energy density in the field dilutes, is simply actually -1. So the energy density is frozen. This is what is shown here. The action field is frozen. The equation of state is -1. And the density, sorry, is constant. And eventually, when the Hubble rate drops below the mass, the field starts to oscillate. It oscillates extremely fast, actually. And the energy density also oscillates. But the envelope, or the average value, scales like 8 to the -3. So like a dark matter candidate. You can see that actually analytically, if you take once the field starts oscillating, because these oscillations are so fast, you can perform an averaging. So you can there are several ways of doing this, either through a WKB approximation or by simply applying the virial theorem, assuming that it applies to the system. You can relate the kinetic energy to the potential energy. And if you plug back in the fact that where is it? If you use this equation here for the average values, applying here the virial theorem, you straightforwardly find that the average equation of states, cycle average equation of states, is equal to 0. And so this shows you that the cosmological density, so then you can estimate the cosmological density by assuming, by taking a simple law, by assuming that you know the densities at the time where the field started to oscillate, and then it dilutes like 8 to the -3. And the time at which the field starts to oscillate is roughly of the order of the mass. Slightly better, I think, is something like 3 times the mass, but whatever. It's order of the mass. This is what you need to remember. And so if you want, you have a simple estimate to know when an action-like particle is a good dark matter candidate, is to require that the oscillations occur before matter radiation equality, which is a moment that is extremely well measured from CMB data. It's around 3,500, a redshift of 3,500. And if you translate that into a Hubble rate and then into a mass, that gives you a mass. It means that on paper, from the point of view of the CMB in this very simple theoretical estimates, masses of actions greater than this could give you a potentially good dark matter candidate. Obviously, this is a very naive estimate of the lower bound on the mass, and you know that they are much stronger bound. This is what I'm going to talk in the future. And to get these bounds now, I'm going to move on from the background description to the evolution of the perturbation. Because as you know, cosmological probes are not only sensitive to the background dynamics, but also to the evolution of action-like particle perturbations. And in fact, one of the key features of action-like particles is that they're going to diverge from the cold dark matter on small scales. So I'm not going to talk too much into details about about linear perturbation theory. This is also something that would take a complete lecture. If you're interested, I really recommend to just look at these typical textbooks. But what you need to know for the purpose of our talk is that what we're going to do is that we're going to perturb the metric and use the Einstein equation to relate it to perturbation of the strange energy tensor. The degrees of freedom in this, there are in principle 10 degrees of freedom just from the symmetry of the metric of the tensors. And we're going to focus at linear order. We can do that. We can split. So first, we can split the degrees of freedom into a scalar, a vector, and a tensor degrees of freedom. And we're going to focus on the scalar degrees of freedom because at linear order, they are decoupled. All these degrees of freedom are decoupled, and scalar vector tensor refers to spatial rotation. If you wonder what are we talking about, we're talking about scalar under spatial rotation, vector under spatial rotation, and so on. So the scalar degrees of freedom associated to the stress energy tensor usually are quantified as things that you probably know very well. So the density perturbation, the velocity perturbation. Here we are talking about a fluid which has a bulk motion, and the bulk motion, the velocity associated to the bulk motion is this velocity perturbation. Usually people prefer to play with what's called the divergence of the velocity perturbation, because this is what appears in the equations. The pressure perturbation, and not only the pressure perturbation, but also the anisotropic pressure. So if you were to look, this would be the TIJ. This would be if you take the pressure would be the TII part of the metric of the stress energy tensor, and this would be the TIJ part of the stress energy tensor. And usually people also quantify the scalar part of the degree of freedom of the TIJ are encoded into what's called the anisotropic shear, which is the longitudinal part of this stress tensor. And we have then for this fourth degree of freedom. So we are going to work for simplicity here. I'm going to kind of put under the carpet the notion of gauge, but I'm going to just assume that I work in a so-called Newtonian gauge. It's making a choice for the description of perturbation. And this gauge is practical because on sub-horizon scale, on very small scales, it goes back to being the standard Newtonian potential that you have in mind. There are two potentials that describe the metric fluctuations, psi and phi here. At a Newtonian scale, you would see that this one is equivalent to the standard Newtonian potential that you are all familiar with. So then what we can do is from the Klein-Gordon equations, we can obtain an evolution for the evolution of field perturbations. So we split where delta phi has been simply related to the background, what we will assume to be a background only time-dependent field, and compared to the true value. So the delta phi is simply the difference between the true field value and some homogeneous hypothetical field value. And from the definition of TMUNU, we can relate this delta phi to our 4 degrees of freedom that I introduced earlier, which takes this shape. This is an exercise you should do by yourself to convince you that this is what happens. And what you would find, and that's also going to make things simpler, is that the shear for a scalar field goes to 0. There is no anisotropic pressure in a scalar field. Alternatively, so you have 2 ways to resolve the equations now. So what typically you would do is you could solve the Klein-Gordon equations, compute the density, the pressure, and the velocity. From this, you can use then Einstein equation here. So you know how this evolves. You can use then Einstein equation to know how the metric reacts. And the metric is going to react to the sum of the perturbation of all densities, because it's all the particles that are talking to gravity. And then you're going to know how the gravitational potential evolves. And then you're going to go back, and as it has evolved, you're going to say this is going to influence how your Klein-Gordon equation is going to evolve, etc. So this is a couple system simply that you can solve. Another way of looking at this problem is that instead of looking at the field at an equation for the perturbation of the field, you can look at an equation directly for the perturbations themselves. So either you can rephrase this equation and plug the definition in, or you can start from the fact that there is a covariant conservation of the stress energy tensor. And if there is no coupling between the species beyond gravity, then it's even conserved within each species. And you can obtain this closed form for the perturbation equations, so the density and the velocity, or the divergence of the velocity. And you'll see these are a bit complicated, and I'm not expecting you to understand all the features that comes out of it. But the key that you need to see from this is that those equations depend on the equation of state parameter, W, and on the sound speed, delta P over delta rho. And we would like to get some insight now on this equation. And one way to do that is, again, to play with this cycle averaging procedure, because as we say, the field is oscillating very fast as compared to the Hubble time. And so what has been shown is that you can get an approximate expression for the sound speed from the cycle averaging of this oscillation. And this is called, we call it an effective sound speed, because of course, this is not the true sound speed of the scalar field. Now you have averaged over the oscillations. Again, putting under the carpet that there are some gauge ambiguities in the way in which you define the sound speed, because sound speed are defined as ratios of perturbations, and perturbations there are gauge ambiguities in the definition of perturbations. But let me forget about this for the sake of this discussion, and just say that there is a famous result at the sound speed of the ultralight particles, or the ultralight action scales like this, where ma is simply the particle, the ULA mass. And what you can see from this is that on very large scales, when k is much greater than 4 times the mass, or 2 times 8 times the mass, rather, on very large scales, the sound speed goes to 1. And so what happens is that you have a power suppression on very small scales. At the opposite scales, when you take k going to 0, you see that the sound speed goes to 0, and you recover the standard behavior of cold dark matter, that is, there is no pressure. So if you take this small scales limit in the previous equation that I showed before, plus you assume you would see that the gravitational potential also becomes simply the Poisson equation, you can obtain a closed form for the evolution of the density perturbation that you probably have seen already. And what you see is that there is a gene scale that appear. Here is the sound speed. For standard dark matter, the sound speed is extremely small. But for axions, because of these properties, we obtain that the sound speed can be large on scales that are greater than this than 4 times 8 times the mass, 2 times 8 times the mass. And if you look, so if you equate this with this, and you rewrite everything, you can obtain the scales for which the sound speed is important. It's called the action gene scales, which is the scale below which perturbations cannot collapse to gravity. And And typically, what you would see is that it can be macroscopic or very large, depending on the mass of the axions. For instance, here, for an axion that is of the order of 10 to the minus 22 eV, and this is the order of magnitude that people have in mind when they try to resolve the small-scale crisis, the so-called small-scale crisis of cold dark matter, that represent all of the dark matter. This today would correspond to 70 megaparsec, or inverse megaparsec. So if you look now at the evolution equations, or the evolution that this equation imprints on the density perturbation, this is what happens, and I probably should have shown that just before, but for very large scales, so the blue are from axions of, I forgot the mass now, I'm sorry, but it's a small mass. The exact value is not really important here. Compared to the dashed line being the cold dark matter, the standard perturbation for cold dark matter. And what you can see is at very early time, something that I've not talked about, that are the evolution on super horizon scales before the modes enter the horizon are also different. I'm not going to talk about this right now. What matters is the sub-horizon scale for our purpose. So on sub-horizon scale, for a large modes, you see that things evolve exactly like cold dark matter. While intermediate modes starts to be suppressed, have perturbation that starts to be suppressed, and small scales mode or large scale modes oscillates. This is what happens. And this has an impact on the matter power spectrum at the end of the day, which would be this square typically. If you assume that this is all of the dark matter, the matter power spectrum would be the sum between this and the baryons are a subfraction. So roughly this is this square. And you obtain this typical suppression as you decrease the mass below some scale. And here is showing you, assuming that all of the dark matter is in the form of axion for various mass. While what you can do is also assume that you have, the mass of your dark matter of the axion-like particle, but you don't know its abundance. And what happens is that as a function of the fraction of the axion-like particle with respect to the dark matter density, you also have an impact on the large scale structure power spectrum.
So Vivian, we have some questions now.
Of course, go ahead, please. I don't see the questions.
Yeah. So first question is from Raghu, that why does the total energy density of the oscillating axion field have oscillation? Is it because of the potential is not quadratic? Or like
no, the potential is quadratic. No, it's just that if you solve, the field is not frozen anymore. Oops, sorry. The field oscillates, and the energy density, which is going to be given by a sum between the kinetic energy and the potential, is going to be also, the answer is that you just sum the kinetic energy and the potential energy, and because the field is oscillating, you end up with this oscillating pattern.
But how it smooths out as you go to higher A?
How is what, sorry?
How the oscillations does not appear at higher value of scale factor.
Right. Yes, that's coming from the fact that after a while, I'm guessing there is an equipartition between energy and the kinetic energy and the potential must be exactly compensating for such that they are able to give exactly this rho to the n to the minus 3.
Okay.
This is probably something like this that is happening.
And another question is from me. So Raghu, just ask you again, sum of the kinetic plus potential energy for oscillating field doesn't just go by 1 over a cube?
Sorry, say that again?
Sum of the kinetic and potential energy of the oscillating field, doesn't it just go as 1 by scale factor cube?
Yes, that's exactly what we're saying. Yes.
Yeah.
That's exactly right.
Okay, but there will be a tiny oscillation also, no? It is not just 1 by a cube.
Yes, exactly. There are small oscillations around this solution coming from the fact that the field is actually oscillating.
Yeah. And another question from me actually, that if there is non-gravitational interactions with the scalar field like axion or axion like any other field, then what will be the change in your this fluid approximation of perturbation, like the sound speed, and there are two parameters, then will there be more term?
Well, so it depends what type of non-gravitational interaction you have in mind. I mean, if you couple your axions
With some fermions, yeah.
Yeah, if you couple your axion to these particles, then you're going to start having collision terms that are going to appear, which might or might not be able to be computed or encoded within just a sound speed. In principle, what you need to do now is really add this collision term, and you would see that it's going to be changing the evolution. So what I'm saying is, when I write these equations here, and I assume that there is no coupling, here you would have now probably a coupling. Maybe you even need to know at the level of the Boltzmann equation, and not the stress energy tensor is an integrated quantity over the Boltzmann distributions. Here you might need to play with the Boltzmann equation directly and include your collision terms.
Okay, great.
This is what happens, for instance, for photons and electrons, which are tightly coupled, which are coupled not only through gravity, but also through Thomson scattering. And so you could imagine modifying these equations. Does not necessarily affect the sound speed. It's probably a different term that happens.
Okay. Okay, great. The rest of the question we can take later.
Okay. So now I'm just wanted to show the impact of this power suppression on observations now. And the one thing that we can compute from the matter power spectrum is the so-called halo mass function. For instance, in the Press-Chester formalism. Oops, sorry. In the Press-Chester, oops. Here we go. Yes, in the Press-Chester formalism. So where we relate the number of structures of halos per unit mass, or per logarithm of the mass here, per decade of mass, if you prefer. We relate this to the power spectrum and some mass function, which this mass function here can be calculated or has been calculated from numerical simulation. So there is an analytical prescription, which is the same. The Press-Chester original prescription is the same that you have seen for primordial black holes and so on. There is refinements coming from, thanks to those guys, where this differential mass function has been a bit refined. And the key is, again, that it depends on the ratios between your density fluctuation, or the power spectrum here, and some critical density, which would be different than from primordial black holes here, because you are not asking for the formation of a black hole, you're asking for the formation of a structure. And this formalism has been well established for dark matter, cold dark matter, sorry. But there is still ongoing work to know really the halo mass function for ultralight axions. What's been advocated is that you can still use this formalism, even though it's been derived for cold dark matter. You might still be able to use this formalism for ultralight axions, simply by saying that in the standard cold dark matter picture, this critical density is taken to be redshift independent. Here, what you can do is you can absorb the effect of the transfer function into the evolution really of the effect of the ultralight action on the evolution of the density perturbation into a time dependent or a redshift dependent and scale dependent critical density. This is what people have done here, for instance. And the impact of this critical density that change with redshift and scales is that it's going to create a cutoff in the halo mass function. And this is why people have been excited about ultralight axions, is because, as you might know, there is a completely debated and debatable problem with the number of of satellites of the Milky Way that we can observe, as opposed to what should be in simulation, much less than we observe than there are in simulations. There are potential baryonic explanation to that. It might just be that we do not see them because they do not initiate baryon star formation and so on. But I believe this is still an ongoing debate, or at least from what I know. And so one way of resolving this is simply by saying, well, you do not create the structures because of a cutoff in the mass function, in the transfer function, and then in the mass function. And this is what you can see here. And then there are ways of probing this halo mass function. So by looking at various observables. So I don't want to talk into the details, but you can look at, people have looked at, for instance, the fact that these halos are going to lead to the formation of stars, and these stars are going to lead to the formation of a UV background. So you can try to look for the UV background created by the first stars and its evolution as a function of redshift to look how the constraints that you can get from that onto the halo mass function. In the future, we will be able, as I said yesterday, to use 21 centimeter to learn on the first stars. And this is also going to be teaching us about how halo formed in the early universe, or in the late universe from the point of view of the CMB, but early universe compared to us. And this is also going to be able to shed light on the nature of dark matter through this way. The other aspect of ULA that is very interesting for this small-scale crisis is the impact of the properties of the ultralight action on the halo density profile. And the intuitive way of understanding what happens is to understand that the ultralight actions have a wave-like nature that shows up on scale of the order of their de Broglie length. The de Broglie length is simply 1 over the momentum here. And if you know the typical velocities in galaxies or dwarf galaxies and so on, is of order a few hundred kilometers, and the mass of your action is of the order 10 to minus 22 again, you find that you can have a de Broglie wavelength that is of order kiloparsec, so a very large de Broglie wavelength. And then you can solve to obtain really the density profile of dark matter, of ultralight action within the halos. You need to solve the non-relativistic version of the Klein-Gordon equation, so the Schrödinger-Poisson equation here. And what you find, what has been found by numerical simulation, but can also be understood by analytical arguments, is that there is a soliton that forms that looks like a core. So this is the density profile as a function of radius, which a soliton is a stationary wave of constant energy, the solution of the Schrödinger equation that is a stationary wave of constant energy. And what you find is that those solitons have a density profile that look like a core that is extremely flat until some characteristic radius, which is called the soliton radius, which is of the same order as the de Broglie wavelength. And of course, what you find also that is very interesting, but is of course coming from the same fact, is that this soliton radius, or this de Broglie length, scales just like the Jeans lengths that you had from the Klein-Gordon equations. So all of those scales are related to one another, and are related to the microscopic properties of your action-like particle with the same scaling, which makes sense since those are all the same behavior that you are seeing on various scales. And so, because of this flattening of the core, it has been said that ultralight action might solve the so-called core cusp problem of CDM. That is, typically CDM would have an NFW profile, would assume lead to cusp in galaxies, while what we seem to observe are rather core. And it's unclear where this comes from. Again, it could be because of baryonic effects, but it's unclear that it can also explain the core that we might see in some dwarf galaxies. So there's lots of literature about whether there is a core cusp problem. But these properties of the action has been believed to potentially alleviate the core cusp problem. So, of course, all of these properties that are extremely interesting also lead to interesting constraints on the action-like particles as dark matter. This is a plot that you've already seen. The models that are interesting to solve the core cusp problem and so on are in this range of mass. And there is the bounds that I want to discuss now are this Lyman alpha bound and the CMB bound that are here. So what is the Lyman alpha bound? This is something that I've already discussed yesterday. That is the idea that distant quasars emit light from a high redshift that is going to be absorbed by a neutral hydrogen along the way. And when the wavelength of the light is resonant with the Lyman alpha Lyman alpha energy level of the hydrogen atoms, then absorption trough that happens. And since there is a lot of neutral hydrogen, we see a forest of absorption, and we can learn about the intergalactic median properties by studying the properties of the Lyman alpha forest. And in particular, this allows us to measure the power spectrum of the unhomogeneities in the Lyman alpha forest, which from complicated hydrodynamical simulation we can predict for ULA-like particles, ultralight action particles. And contrarily to primordial black holes, here the power suppression leads to a power suppression. So here is the comparison between, for instance, an ultralight action with a mass of 10 to the minus 21 eV and the best fit model, which is not important for discussion here, where you see this suppression in the flux power spectrum. This is called the flux power spectrum of the Lyman for the Lyman alpha forest. And if you look at what type of constraint that gives, here is the bond from 2017 looked like this, where you can constrain both the mass and the fraction of ultralight axions. For 100% of ultralight axions, that would give a mass constraints on the mass of the order of 2 × 10 to the minus 21 eV, which cuts deeply in this interesting parameter space that we have mentioned for the small scale crisis. But recently, it's been claimed that you can get actually much stronger bond from the Lyman alpha. I'm not completely sure where this comes from. I would need to really read this paper and understand them better to tell you, but the most up-to-date and the latest bond is actually extremely strong, since it excludes 10 to the minus 20. It's even outside of these figures. It excludes everything as dark matter below 10 to the minus 20. So maybe there are questions about this before I move on with the CMB.
Yeah, there are a couple of questions. So one is just what you said related to about the de Broglie wavelength, that Raghu is asking where this velocity of 100 km/s come from.
Oh, it's the typical velocities of stars actually in galaxies or in dwarf galaxies, and we assume that it is the same that applies for dark matter particles here. So it's measurements.
Okay, you assume it's the same for dark matter particle. Yeah. And then another question is, what are the Z in your ULA halo density profile plot? And are those profiles calculated with point mass black hole approximation at the center?
So those are redshifts. So yes, I should probably have commented a bit more. So these are simulation of trying to solve this equation. These are collisions of, those are solitons that collide and form these halos. And this is just a zoom of this. And this is the evolution of the density profile as this processes is occurring. So no, I'm not sure about all the approximations related to going from here to here, or just how they solve that. I would rather have you look into the paper, but they are really solving the Schrödinger-Poisson equation here numerically.
Okay. And another question related, a little bit different, but Suruj Jyotidas asked, is the perturbation of inflaton field not taken along with the perturbation of axion field when you showed the perturbation?
Right. So here we are assuming I'm going to talk about the perturbation of the action field in an instant. In these figures, when I'm talking about when I'm showing the matter power spectrum, I'm indeed assuming that the axions has an adiabatic spectrum coming from inflation. You're right that there are also axion isocurvature that I'm going to talk about in this type of scenario in a minute.
Okay. And one last question related to this is, solitons typically has a location and has a calculable energy located within some range. Do these two things have any meaning in this context of dark matter halo model? Right.
Yes, they allow you to, exactly. I mean, they allow you to quantify the scale of your solitons. So this is exactly what this is here. The radius of your core, if you prefer, and the typical energy density is going to be related to your to the soliton as well. That you can so you can compute the energy density and the scale of your soliton, of your profile, thanks to the soliton solution of this equation.
Okay, great. So this was a question from Sandeepan from IIT Kharagpur, and then one last question from Raghu. Do you presume any thermalization of dark matter? Is there a possibility of Bose-Einstein's condensation?
Well, so this is a topic that I'm really not too familiar with. My understanding, so I was trying to get a little bit of insight about this, but I don't have much to say except that there is my understanding is that this type of fields, they are classical fields, and so you can say that they are Bose-Einstein condensate. The difference is what is the correlation length of your Bose-Einstein condensate. It does not match the soliton here. This is not the scale that you would get. But so I don't really know exactly what is to be very honest, much of the literature about Bose-Einstein condensate. I understand there is a debate. What matters for us is that we're assuming that these fields are described by classical equations, which is also what describes the Bose-Einstein condensate. So in this context, you could say that there is a connection.
Okay, great.
But you should look, David Marsh has a discussion about this in his review, which refers also to papers that tries to go into the depth of whether or not you expect Bose-Einstein condensate and there is actually, at the end of the day, the conclusion is that it looks like it's a red herring, and since we're talking about a classical field, it is to some extent a Bose-Einstein condensate, except that the correlation length is not necessarily the one that you expect.
Okay, thanks. So now you can move ahead with the CMB.
All right, so now moving on. So just to something else, that is, what are the constraints that you can get on the presence of ultralight axions from the CMB? So the first thing to say, if you're interested in constraining really the absolute, the mass of your ultralight axions, the CMB is not the best probe. And this is very simple because the CMB probes large scales, linear scales, while the effect of the ultralight axions happen at small scales. So of course, it's better to look at Lyman alpha to get constraints. However, the CMB is very sensitive to, it's very well measured. So it's sensitive to ultralight axions that would be dynamical during the time at which it is created, or it is the acoustic waves and so on are occurring. And to get a typical insight as to what typical mass are probed by the CMB, you can just simply make a connection between what multiple enters or what multiples are probed by a given experiment, for instance, WMAT Planck, and and at what time that multiple entered the horizon, which is given here by this connection. And this redshift, which you can then map to a Hubble rate at that time, tells you what is the typical mass that is going to have an effect on the CMB. The key idea is that the real effects on the CMB do not come from the behavior of the dark matter-like behavior. They actually come from the fact that the ultralight axion originally was frozen. So the constraints, basically what the CMB tries to do is make sure that your ultralight axion behaves like a dark matter and not like a frozen scalar field. And there are two main constraints. The constraining power comes from two different effects depending on whether your field becomes dynamical before or after the recombination. So before or after the photon starts to free stream. If the fields become dynamical before recombination, and here I'm really going fast to cut it short, the main effect, so it comes from the fact that it imprints a very specific time evolution of the gravitational potential. So the fact that your ultralight axions is not exactly a dark matter, but is frozen and then starts to dilute, this has an impact on the time evolution of the gravitational potential. And something that you might have heard, and I'm sorry if you've not seen that yet, is that the CMB power spectrum, especially the temperature one here, can be quantified as the sum of three terms, what we call the Sachs-Wolf term, which is simply the value of the temperature fluctuation at last scattering plus the gravitational potential, but it's typically the value of the intrinsic anisotropy. And then there are effects due to the Doppler motion of the material from which the photons escape, and the effect of the time variation of the gravitational potential. And the main effect of the action is to affect the time evolution of the gravitational potential. This is actually from where we also measure the main impact of dark matter as coming from the impact on the integrated isosceles effect. And so when you change the time evolution of the gravitational potential, it leads to this huge increase in the anisotropy of the CMB. And so if your dark matter was not, if your action like was not behaving exactly like a dark matter component around matter radiation equality, but was still in the phase of transitioning from being frozen to the phase where it becomes where it dilutes, then it leads to these huge bumps. But as you increase the mass, so as you make this transition happen earlier and earlier, you see that these features goes away. The second part is that the fields, now the second part of the constraints comes when the fields become dynamical at later times. And when the field becomes dynamical at later times, the main effect it has is to impact the angular diameter distance. So it changes the way in which the Hubble rate scales with redshift. And it can shift, and the angular diameter distance simply tells you how far the CMB peaks are from us. And so this corresponds to an overall shift of the spectrum along the multiple axes. On top of that, this effect still occurs, and the time evolution of the gravitational potential is still affected. And this is what leads to these typical bumps here. But the typical shift that you see is really a pure background effect. And this allows to put constraints on the fraction of ultralight action as the function of the mass. So from the point of view of the CMB, you can have, it is perfectly fine to have an action as a dark matter above something like 10 to the minus 24 eV. On the other hand, if you go to the very low mass, action could be dark energy if their mass was below 10 to the minus 33 eV. And in between, the effects are constrained to limit their abundance to a few %. Now I see that the time is going along, so I won't have time to, is going on, so it's passing by fast. So I won't have time to talk about what happens and the connection to the Hubble tension, but there are actually ways of relaxing and actually maybe even detecting something that looks like an axion in the regime where the mass is of order 10 to the minus 28 eV. But let me talk for the last part, that for the last minute, let me talk about the fact that in this model where the axion the symmetry is broken during inflation, the initial conditions for the action are not perfectly adiabatic. There is a component coming from an isocurvature mode of perturbation. And just a brief introduction about what we mean by adiabatic and isocurvature. So basically what you need to have in mind is that we are solving linear equations. And we can find the basis to describe the solution, and typically the basis of, or to describe the initial conditions here in this context. And the basis that we choose usually is a basis in which we have something called an adiabatic mode and the number of isocurvature mode, and the adiabatic mode and this isocurvature mode evolved independently from one another. The sectors evolved independently from one another. And the adiabatic mode has interesting properties, and typically is defined by the fact that it verifies that the relative number densities of species are not perturbed. Rather, it's the overall densities that is perturbed. And if you assume a relation between rho and p, a simple equation of state relation between the pressure and the density, that is the case for us, you can find that your adiabatic modes perturbation follow simple relations and are all related in these ways. And for an action-like fluid whose equation of state is -1 originally, you find that what you probably know for a cosmological constant, that is, you can start from assuming that there are initially no adiabatic perturbations, and then the gravitational potential that are created by the initial fluctuations in the density, or that are the evolution of the gravitational potential that is dictated by the perturbation of the photon fluid, are going to impact the evolution of your density of the action-like particle density fluctuation and lead to the creation of density fluctuation.
You have like 1 or 2 minutes.
Right, but on top of adiabatic fluctuation, there is isocurvature fluctuations that comes from that are simply now the variation in the particle number ratios at constant total density perturbation. So again, basically you're saying that you have the same density, the total density perturbation is fixed, but you adjust the number density of your species such that the total density is fixed. This is what we call an isocurvature, because now the curvature is the same. And in the case where the Pei-Check-Win symmetry is broken before inflation, this is what occurs for inflation for action, because in that case, action exists as massless field during inflation and develop perturbation. This is a very standard result that is the same for developed perturbation of the order of the inflation, the Hubble rate or the inflation energy scale over 2π. So this, if you remember, this is just the temperature associated to the De Sitter space in the early universe. And of course, this is actually the same as the one that you would see if you study tensor modes and the evolution of gravitational waves from inflation. And so the amplitude of the isocurvature modes are directly related to the amplitude of the tensor modes in the CMB. And the reason is the same is because the graviton is also, you can describe it as a massless scalar field, and you're going to get the same equations. And so what's drive the amplitude of tensor modes is also going to drive the amplitude of isocurvature fluctuation of axions. So this is extremely powerful, because then it means that if you have a bound on the tensor to scalar ratio, you can bound the energy scale of inflation, and in turn you can bound axion curvature, isocurvature perturbations. And conversely, what is actually extremely interesting is that if you were to detect the tensor to scalar ratio, for instance with BICEP, as it has been announced in 2014, you would force, once you detect the scalar tensor to scalar ratio, it would mean that you predict, if dark matter is made of ultralight axion, you would predict a certain level of isocurvature perturbation, which you can look for. There is a constraint on that from Planck data. And if you don't see any, this would strongly constrain, and probably at the level for which BICEP was supposed to detect or had claimed to detect the tensor to scalar ratio, it was even completely excluding the possibility of the Pei-Check-Win symmetry being broken before inflation. So since I'm running out of time, I apologize again. I was a bit ambitious about what I can say, and I'm going to stop there. I'm not going to talk about this idea that action-like can also be a dark energy candidate, but please go ahead if you have questions, and I'm going to jump to my conclusions now. Yes, one thing that I want to stress before I leave you is that you can play. There are numerical codes that allow you to play with action-like particles as dark matter, dark energy, and so on. There is one that has been described, that has been written with SCEMB, and one that has been written with CLASS by myself and collaborators. And please go have a look. Both of them are public, and you can try to reproduce these figures that I've seen that I've shown here in these lectures. So to conclude, action-like particles can play many roles in cosmology. They can be inflaton. There are models in which action-like particles are the inflaton. There are models in which action-like particles are the dark energy. There are models where they are obviously dark matter. And this forces us to think, could there be connection between all of these dark sectors? As a dark matter candidate, it could explain the small-scale crisis of called dark matter. As a dark energy candidate, it could explain the things that I've not talked about that are the old and new cosmological constant problem. As an inflaton candidate, it made prediction for the scalar to tensor ratio, and potentially that is potentially detectable by next generation experiments. And even now, as I mentioned briefly, it could also play the role of an early dark energy candidate to resolve the so-called Hubble tension. But of course, there are lots of constraints on the action-like particles, and it's unclear whether we have discovered it or whether we have excluded it. So thank you very much for your attention, and I'm going to take questions if there are any.
Thanks, Vivian, for giving 2 talks. So here we are completing our pedagogical lectures. I think we have a lot of questions already on the way. So one request that, as you could not speak about the early dark energy and Hubble tension, if you can give us the slides, we can upload.
Oh yes, absolutely. The slides are going to be. I have to put them online. I have to understand how to reconnect to log in. I had problems, but it's going to be easy. No problem.
So David Marsh was telling yesterday that with Hiranya Perry's paper on Lyman alpha, basically yes, the dark matter solution is almost like only around 10% axion ULA dark matter is allowed.
Yes. Yes.
But I also haven't read the paper. But if
yes, so this is a recent paper where they use. I mean, it's too technical for me to really understand, but they're claiming that the bound has improved by an order of magnitude compared to. to the standard number that I would have told you before. So it went from a few 10 to the minus 21 to few 10 to the minus 20.
So let us thanks Vivian. You can unmute, but on behalf of everybody, thanks Vivian for giving this.
No, thank you very much.
Yeah, thanks a lot. So we'll see you all after lunch.
Yes. Yes, I'll be.
So Vivian, this is Kaushik here. So can I ask you? Kind of general questions which you did not broadly cover, but this is a general confusion that I have. So, in the case when PQ symmetry is broken after inflation, okay. So as David Marsh was trying to emphasize in his talks, so there is this two mechanism of producing this action. So one is this let's say the misalignment, which all of you are essentially talking about, the cosmological constraints, and also this decay. I mean, from the topological defects, you have this decay. Now, is there any consensus understanding? I mean, which contributions is going to be, dominating? I mean, in the total dark matter contribution. I mean, because these two setups are completely different. It looks to me. I mean, like the observational consequences and some of those. So what is the story there? Like,
yeah,
you have this misalignment contributions, and there is this one more contribution. Okay. Now, is it that finally this cosmological signatures for both the cases are going to be of the similar type, or what is?
Okay, so the cosmological signature. Let me try to say something without saying too much stupid things, because this is really, I've not really studied this part of the scenarios. So my understanding is that if the thing that I'm not sure exactly whether there is an easy way to know what is dominating the cosmological density of action in these scenarios. I'm guessing it depends on the model, because in one case, because typically, so the misalignment mechanism now for these ultralight actions is going to doesn't have the same features, where now you have to average over the initial field values, and so the field values is typically fixed to be something like what is it, pi square over 3, or I mean, I don't remember what I was saying, but anyway, so I'm guessing depending on the models, you can probably play such that the densities are dominated either by the effect of the string decays or by the effect of the misalignment mechanism. Although I'm not completely sure of that, I must admit. We should have asked David to really have this answer. The constraints are in general, I think, relatively similar, except that whether or not I don't think you will have the same constraints coming from this Isor curvature I discussed before, because the field is not massless during inflation. However, there are constraints that can come from the fact that these topological defects might lead to the creation of action mini cluster, which is another type of constraints. So I would say the broad picture is probably similar, but details might affect the constraints. But to be honest, I'm really not an expert on this type of scenarios. So I believe it's better that you look into these reviews by David Marsh to have a more clean picture.
Because in the case of the constants that you are talking, I mean, this misalignment. So here the action field is like this coherent oscillations, whereas in the case of this decay, I mean, these actions essentially, is it that its behavior in the end for the cosmological, I mean, from the productions and where you essentially make the observations, is it still becoming like this coherent picture that is like, I can describe in a similar?
Yeah, I believe that's the case. It's a fair question. I understand your point, whether you can describe it. I believe that, yes, this is what people are doing. They are describing the field as a coherent field over the Hubble scales that you need to consider. But it's unclear to me exactly where that's going. I think there are discussions about this. Unfortunately, I don't have the good argument to tell you as to why it applies. You should look into these reviews. I think there is a discussion, and I'm sorry if I can't cover this question. But it's a fair question. Yes, I agree that this is not a trivial answer. There is no trivial answer to that, and you should look into this.
Yeah, we have a couple of talks on Igor Tachev and also Javier Redondo. I presume they will be talking about something along that line. I don't know.
I think at the end, what you have to do is consider the cosmological. You have to consider the average of the initial field values and so on. So it's a different picture that you are talking about.
So Vivian, one question about that dark energy, IBD dark energy. So this 10 to the power minus 28 electron volt is what basically solves the CMB, the H0 tension. Yeah.
The shortcut is yes. The truth is that you also need to change a bit the potential. You need to play with the potential, but the mass that you would assume that you would derive is going to be order 10 to minus 28 eV. Yes.
So one question is when the field is released from the Hubble friction and before it reaches and starts oscillating, suppose the field is released from a high value, and can it gain a lot of kinetic energy and then it depletes a lot of energy already, and you don't have that much energy left to oscillate? Is it possible?
Yes, it can happen. So in this m square phi square type of potential, it does not happen. But you can imagine that if you change the potential, you can have a steep potential such that now it becomes kinetic energy dominated. It depends on the potential.
Oh, okay. And
so
is there any?
So if you, I have a let me show you a figure quickly.
Yeah.
Let me share my screen again.
Yeah.
And just show you a figure to explain that. Do you see my screen?
Yeah.
So those are potentials where instead of the standard action potential, we add a little power law here.
Yeah.
And as you add a power law, it makes the potential more box-like and steeper from the point. And so you go from this, the standard action potential is the yellow.
Yeah.
And as you make the potential steeper, this is exactly what happens. That is the energy density starts to be more and more dominated by the kinetic term.
No, but that domination is when it oscillates. But I am asking when it doesn't even reach the minima on the way to the.
Yeah. You can cut this potential, and you can indeed make it. You can just. What you need to do is simply have a potential. You can just imagine something that is extremely steep, such that it never oscillates, and it just is completely dominated by its kinetic energy. That's possible, yes, as well.
Yeah. But in the Weinhuss recent paper, they claim that with m square phi square also that kinetic domination is possible. Have you seen that paper that the kinetic energy can take away?
No, I'm not sure exactly how this is possible. I don't know. You can show me the paper maybe.
Yeah. Okay. Where they showed all are unmuted now. Raghavan has told me. So in case somebody else wants to join this conversation, because it's a very interesting topic, if you have 5 minutes, we can continue. Yeah. Okay, I got the point. And another thing is there another probe of this 10 to the power minus 28 electron volt other than, because we are just solving an anomaly, but is there any other probe where it can show up?
Yeah, in large scale structures, for instance, and even the CMB actually has signatures. So you can look for it by looking at the imprints on the CMB or on large scale structures. So yes, you have ways of testing the model, absolutely.
Yeah. Okay. If anybody wants to add to this discussion or anything, because he could not cover this topic, you are welcome, but I don't see any questions.
Vivian, I had a question.
Yeah.
You mentioned that the velocity that you're going to take for these dark matter particles is the same as the velocity for stars in the halo or in the galaxy. Now, I would expect that the velocity of the baryonic matter in a galaxy is related to the original angular momentum of the ball of gas or the original angular momentum of the baryonic matter that collapsed and formed the black hole. Formed the galaxy. Do we expect the dark matter halos to also have an angular momentum that mimics the baryonic matter? Otherwise, why would I take the same velocity for stars as that for?
It's the same gravitational potential that they are feeling. That's the idea. And those are you see them basically stars and particles. You see them as test mass sensitive to gravitational potential. So there is no reason really, I believe, to see a difference in their behavior.
is the rotation of galaxies purely linked to its gravitational potential or to the initial angular momentum that baryonic density perturbation had before it collapsed to form?
So you're right that if you need some angular momentum to have the rotation, that I agree, but that's a fair question. But I'm not sure exactly how it happens, but I'm guessing in the context of merging and so on. So what I'm saying is, if you see stars and dark matter particles as test mass, don't really see why the idea is that from that point of view, they behave the same as with respect to whatever happens to the. Don't start from a. It's not a situation in which the dark matter is purely spherical and the stars have an angular momentum. I mean, there is a merging process. Then there is pressure, there is friction and stuff like that might affect baryons and not dark matter. But the angular momentum is gonna be given to both type of particle in this mess. There is no distinction there.
In fact, even if there's an initial source, it would probably, if it had some gravitational origin or something, then it will be for both of them.
Yes.
Or some initial condition would be for both of them.
Yes.
Thanks.
Okay, thanks. So thanks, Vivian. We'll see you. Maybe if you are free, you can join after lunch. There are some interesting talks. Yeah.
Yes. I'll be there for the rest of the workshop.
Okay, thanks a lot. Okay. Thanks, Raghu. Also, I'm ending the meeting now.
Okay.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thanks.
See you.
Thanks, Vivian. Thank you.